Some secrets are meant to stay buried, hidden behind locked doors and forgotten memories. But what happens when the person you trust most, the one who shares your bed and your dreams, has been keeping something so devastating that it threatens to destroy everything you believed about your life together? Charles had always thought he knew every corner of their sprawling country estate. After 23 years of marriage, he believed there were no mysteries left between him and Camilla. The old Victorian mansion had been in her family for generations, its creaking floors and shadowy corners as familiar to him as his own reflection. He had walked those halls countless times, memorized every painting, every antique, every secret passage the old house was rumored to contain. But he was wrong. On a rain-soaked Thursday evening in March, while searching for legal documents in what he thought was just another storage room, Charles would stumble upon a discovery that would shatter everything he thought he knew about his wife, his marriage, and the woman who had shared his life for over 2 decades. What he found behind that hidden door wouldn't just change his understanding of Camilla. It would reveal a truth so shocking, so impossible to comprehend, that it would force him to question every moment they had shared together, every word she had ever spoken, and every promise she had ever made. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Charles wiped the rain from his glasses as he stepped through the heavy oak doors of Fairmont Manor. The March storm had caught him off guard during his evening walk around the estate grounds, and now water dripped from his coat onto the polished marble floor of the entrance hall. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 8 times, its deep voice echoing through the empty corridors. Camilla wouldn't be home until late. Her monthly book club meeting at the village library always ran past 10, sometimes even midnight when Mrs. Henderson brought her famous apple brandy. Charles had grown accustomed to these quiet Thursday evenings alone in the vast house, though tonight felt different somehow. The storm outside seemed more violent than usual, rattling the old windows and causing the lights to flicker intermittently. He hung his wet coat in the hall closet and made his way to the kitchen, where he prepared a simple dinner of leftover shepherd's pie and a cup of tea. The silence of the house felt heavier tonight, broken only by the occasional crack of thunder and the steady drumming of rain against the glass. After finishing his meal, Charles remembered the reason Camilla had asked him to stay in tonight rather than join his usual Thursday poker game with the neighbors. The insurance company needed copies of the property deeds and old building permits for their policy renewal. Camilla had mentioned that all the important documents were stored somewhere in the East Wing, probably in one of the old servants' quarters that had been converted to storage rooms decades ago. She had been vague about the exact location, waving her hand dismissively when he asked for specifics. Charles climbed the main staircase, his footsteps muffled by the thick Persian runner. The East Wing had always been the least used part of the house. Most of the rooms there had been closed off for years, their furniture covered in dust sheets like ghosts waiting to be awakened. The electrical system in that section was unreliable, installed sometime in the 1950s, and never properly updated. He carried a heavy flashlight, knowing the wall switches in that part of the house were temperamental at best. The beam cut through the darkness as he made his way down the narrow corridor, past doors he rarely opened anymore. Some led to bedrooms that hadn't been slept in for decades, others to small sitting rooms filled with furniture from Camilla's grandmother's generation. The first storage room he tried contained nothing but Christmas decorations and old garden tools. Boxes of ornaments sat stacked against the walls, their contents wrapped in tissue paper and stored with the careful precision that Camilla brought to everything in her life. He spent nearly an hour searching through filing cabinets and cardboard boxes, finding old receipts, expired warranties, and photograph albums, but nothing related to property documents. The second room proved equally fruitless. Here, Camilla's mother's china was carefully packed away, along with sets of crystal that probably hadn't seen daylight since the 1980s. Charles found himself momentarily distracted by a box of old letters tied with blue ribbons. But they were just correspondence between Camilla's mother and various distant relatives, nothing that would interest an insurance company. He was beginning to think Camilla had been mistaken about the location of the documents when he noticed something odd about the far wall of the third storage room. The flashlight beam caught what looked like an irregularity in the wood paneling. At first, he thought it might be damage from the roof leak they'd had repaired 2 summers ago, but as he moved closer, he realized it was something else entirely. The panel didn't quite align with the others around it. There was a thin gap, barely visible unless you were looking for it, running along what appeared to be a rectangular section about 3 feet wide and 6 feet tall. Charles ran his fingers along the edges, feeling for any kind of mechanism or handle. The wood was slightly different here too, not quite the same stain or grain as the surrounding panels. He pressed against various points on the panel, remembering stories Camilla had told him about old houses like this one having hidden passages and secret rooms. Her great-grandfather had been somewhat paranoid about burglars and had supposedly built several concealed storage areas throughout the house. Charles had always assumed these were just family legends, the kind of stories that grow more elaborate with each telling. But when he pressed firmly against the upper right corner of the suspicious panel, he felt it give slightly. There was a soft click, barely audible over the storm outside, and the entire section of wall swung inward on silent hinges. Cool air rushed out from the opening, carrying with it a scent that Charles couldn't immediately identify, something musty and old, but with an underlying sweetness that seemed oddly familiar. His heart began beating faster as he shone the flashlight through the opening. Beyond was a narrow staircase leading downward, its steps carved from what looked like the same stone as the house's foundation. The walls on either side were rough-hewn rock, suggesting this passage had been built when the house was first constructed over 100 years ago. Charles paused at the threshold, uncertain whether he should proceed. Camilla had never mentioned this hidden stairway, which seemed impossible given how thoroughly they had discussed the house's history when they first moved in together. She knew every detail about the property, from the year each room had been added to the craftsman who had created the ornate plasterwork in the main dining room. The rational part of his mind suggested he should wait for Camilla to return and explore this discovery together. But curiosity won out over caution, and he stepped carefully onto the first stone step. The stairs were steep and narrow, clearly designed for practical use rather than comfort. He counted 22 steps before reaching the bottom, where another door blocked his path. This door was different from the panel above, heavy dark wood reinforced with iron bands that looked medieval in their design. There was no visible lock or handle, just a large iron ring set into the wood at about shoulder height. Charles grasped the ring and pulled, expecting resistance, but the door opened smoothly and silently as if it had been recently oiled. The space beyond took his breath away. He found himself standing at the entrance to a large underground chamber, much bigger than he would have thought possible given the house's layout above. The beam of his flashlight revealed stone walls covered with wooden shelving that stretched from floor to ceiling. But it wasn't the size of the room that shocked him, it was what filled it. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of photographs covered every available surface. They were arranged with obsessive precision, organized in a way that suggested years of careful curation. Charles moved deeper into the room, his flashlight beam revealing more details with each step. Many of the photographs appeared to be quite old, their sepia tones and formal poses suggesting they dated back to the early 1900s or even earlier. But as his eyes adjusted to the gloom and he began to examine the images more closely, he realized with growing unease that every single photograph contained the same face. The same woman, appearing again and again across what must have been decades of time. In some photos, she appeared young, barely out of her teens. In others, she looked to be in her 30s or 40s. The clothing styles and photographic techniques varied dramatically, confirming that these images spanned many years, possibly even different centuries. The woman in the photographs was unmistakably Camilla. Charles felt his knees weaken as the impossibility of what he was seeing began to sink in. He knew his wife's face as well as his own, had studied it across the breakfast table every morning for 23 years. These weren't just photographs that resembled Camilla, they were photographs of her. Every detail was identical, from the distinctive mole just below her left ear to the slight asymmetry of her smile that he found so charming. But that was impossible. Some of these photographs clearly predated Camilla's birth by decades. The oldest ones, judging by their style and the clothing worn by the subjects, appeared to be from the 1800s. Others looked to be from the 1920s, 40s, 60s. There was even what appeared to be a daguerreotype, the kind of early photograph that had been popular in the mid-1800s. With trembling hands, Charles lifted one of the framed photographs from a nearby shelf. It showed Camilla in Victorian dress, standing beside a man in a military uniform he didn't recognize. The formal pose and elaborate costume suggested this was a wedding photograph, but the style was clearly from at least 150 years ago. Yet the woman in the image was undeniably his wife, down to the small scar on her chin from a childhood accident she had described to him many times. He set down that photograph and picked up another, this one showing Camilla in what looked like 1920s fashion, complete with a beaded headband and drop-waist dress. She was standing in front of what appeared to be the same house they lived in now, though the landscaping was different, simpler. Behind her, barely visible in the background, was another figure that made Charles's blood run cold. It was himself, not someone who looked like him, but actually him. Charles recognized his own face with the same certainty with which he had identified Camilla's. He was wearing clothes from the 1920s, his hair styled in the fashion of that era, but his features were identical to what he saw in the mirror every morning. Even the small scar above his right eyebrow, the result of a childhood fall from his bicycle, was clearly visible in the old photograph. Charles dropped the photograph, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the flashlight steady. The glass frame shattered when it hit the stone floor, but he barely noticed the sound. His mind was reeling, trying to process what he was seeing, trying to find some rational explanation for images that defied everything he understood about reality. He stumbled backward, his flashlight beam sweeping wildly across the walls of photographs. Everywhere he looked, he saw the same impossible sight. Himself and Camilla appearing together across different eras, different decades, different centuries. Sometimes they appeared to be the same age as they were now, sometimes younger, sometimes older. But it was always unmistakably them. The beam of his flashlight caught something else as he backed toward the door, a large wooden desk in the far corner of the room that he hadn't noticed before. Its surface was covered with what looked like journals or ledgers, their leather covers worn smooth with age. Next to them was an ornate wooden box, its lid slightly ajar. Charles knew he should leave, should run back up those stone steps, and out of this impossible room. Every instinct told him that he had stumbled into something he wasn't meant to see, something that would change everything between him and Camilla. But the same curiosity that had brought him down here in the first place drew him toward that desk, toward whatever secrets those journals might contain. As he approached the desk, his flashlight illuminated the open box, revealing its contents. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, were more photographs, but these appeared to be much older than the ones on the walls. Some were so faded they were barely visible, their images ghostly impressions on yellowed paper. But even in their deteriorated state, Charles could make out the familiar faces staring back at him. He reached for the topmost journal, its leather cover cracked with age. The pages inside were filled with Camilla's handwriting, her distinctive script unchanged despite the clearly ancient ink and paper. The dates at the top of each entry made no sense. Some were from the 1800s, others from decades he remembered living through. But with Camilla writing about events that had supposedly happened long before she was born. Thunder crashed outside the house above, reminding Charles that he was far underground, surrounded by impossible evidence of something his rational mind could not accept. The storm seemed to be intensifying, and he realized he had been down here much longer than he had intended. Camilla would be home soon, and he still hadn't found the insurance documents she had asked him to locate. But as he stood in that underground chamber, surrounded by photographs that documented an impossible history, Charles realized that finding those documents was no longer his primary concern. Whatever he had discovered here was far more significant than property deeds or building permits. This room represented a secret that Camilla had kept from him throughout their entire marriage, a secret that suggested their relationship was built on a foundation he didn't understand. The sound of a car door slamming somewhere above made his heart jump. Camilla was home early from her book club meeting. Charles quickly closed the journal and placed it back on the desk, his mind racing as he tried to decide what to do. Should he confront her immediately with what he had found? Should he pretend he had never discovered this room? Should he take some of the photographs as evidence, or would their absence be noticed? He could hear footsteps above, muffled by the stone ceiling but clearly moving through the house. Camilla was calling his name, her voice carrying a note of concern that might have been normal worry about her husband's whereabouts, or might have been something else entirely. In light of what he had just discovered, every aspect of their relationship suddenly seemed suspect. Every conversation they had ever had potentially filled with hidden meaning. Charles made a quick decision. He would leave everything exactly as he had found it, and return to the main part of the house, pretending he had found the insurance documents somewhere else. He needed time to process what he had seen, to figure out what it meant, and how to confront Camilla about it. This discovery was too enormous, too impossible, to address without careful thought. He switched off his flashlight and carefully made his way back through the darkness toward the hidden door, guided by memory and the faint light filtering down from the storage room above. Each step up those stone stairs felt like a step away from one reality and back toward another, though he was no longer certain which was real and which was an illusion he had been living for 23 years. Charles emerged from the hidden chamber with his mind spinning like a tornado. His hands still trembled as he carefully sealed the panel behind him, making sure it looked exactly as it had before he discovered its secret. The storage room seemed different now, ordinary and innocent in a way that felt almost mocking given what lay concealed beneath it. He could hear Camilla's footsteps moving through the house above, her voice calling his name with increasing urgency. He grabbed a random box of old receipts from one of the filing cabinets and hurried toward the main part of the house, trying to compose himself as he walked. His heart hammered against his ribs, and he realized his entire body was covered in cold sweat despite the chill of the March evening. The images from the hidden chamber burned in his memory like acid, each impossible photograph challenging everything he thought he knew about reality. When he reached the main staircase, he found Camilla standing at the bottom, her coat still damp from the rain and her car keys in her hand. She looked exactly as she had every evening for 23 years, her silver hair pulled back in its customary loose bun, her green eyes warm with concern. There was nothing different about her appearance, nothing that suggested she was anything other than the woman he had married in a small ceremony at the village church all those years ago. But now Charles found himself studying her face with new intensity, searching for some sign that she was aware of what he had discovered. Did she know about the hidden chamber? Had she been waiting for him to find it? Was his stumbling into that room part of some larger plan she had been orchestrating for decades? "Charles, there you are," she said, relief evident in her voice. "I was worried when I didn't find you in the usual places. The book club ended early tonight because of the storm. Mrs. Henderson's power went out just as we were discussing the ending of the novel." She paused, studying his face with the same intensity he was applying to hers. "Are you feeling all right? You look rather pale." "I'm fine," he managed, though his voice sounded strange even to himself. "Just tired from searching through all those boxes upstairs. I found some of the documents the insurance company needs." He held up the box of receipts, hoping she wouldn't ask to examine its contents too closely. Camilla smiled, the same warm expression that had greeted him countless mornings across the breakfast table. "Wonderful. I was afraid they might be harder to locate. The East Wing is such a maze of storage rooms, and I haven't been through most of them in years." She moved closer, reaching up to brush something from his shoulder. "You've got cobwebs in your hair. Those old rooms certainly haven't been cleaned recently." Charles flinched slightly at her touch, then immediately felt guilty for his reaction. This was Camilla, his wife, the woman who had supported him through the loss of his job 5 years ago, who had nursed him back to health after his heart attack, who had shared his bed and his dreams and his fears for more than 2 decades. Whatever was happening here, whatever those photographs meant, she was still the person he loved. But as they walked together toward the kitchen, Charles found himself hyper-aware of every detail about her. The way she moved, graceful and purposeful as always. The slight limp in her left leg that she claimed was from an old riding accident, though she had never been able to tell him exactly when or where it had occurred. The small habits and mannerisms he had attributed to personal quirks now seemed potentially significant in ways he couldn't quite articulate. "I'll make us some tea," Camilla said, moving toward the stove with practiced efficiency. "You still look unsettled. Did something happen while I was out?" Her tone was casual, but Charles detected something underneath it, a watchfulness that might have been normal spousal concern or might have been something else entirely. "Nothing happened," he said, settling into his usual chair at the kitchen table. "Just the storm making the house feel eerie. You know how these old places can be when the wind picks up." He watched carefully for her reaction, but Camilla simply nodded and continued preparing the tea as if his words were perfectly ordinary. "The house does have its moods," she agreed, taking 2 cups from the cabinet. "Sometimes I think it holds memories in its walls, echoes of all the people who have lived here over the years." She paused in her movements, her back still turned to him. "Do you ever feel that, Charles? As if the past is still present somehow, layered underneath what we see?" The question sent a chill down Charles's spine. Was she talking about the hidden chamber? Did she know he had found it? "I suppose all old houses feel that way," he said carefully. "Lots of history in a place like this." Camilla turned to face him, the teapot in her hands, and for a moment Charles thought he saw something different in her eyes. Not quite sadness, but a kind of profound weariness, as if she were carrying a burden too heavy to be shared. Then, the expression was gone, replaced by her familiar warm smile. "More history than you might imagine," she said softly, pouring the hot water into their cups. This house has seen so many lives, so many loves and losses. Sometimes I feel as though I know stories about this place that I couldn't possibly know, as if they were somehow passed down to me in ways that don't quite make sense. Charles accepted his cup of tea with hands that he hoped weren't shaking visibly. The conversation felt loaded with hidden meaning, each of Camilla's words potentially significant in light of what he had discovered. Was she trying to tell him something without actually saying it? Was this her way of preparing him for a revelation she knew was coming? What kind of stories? He asked, trying to keep his voice neutral despite the turmoil in his mind. Camilla settled into the chair across from him, cradling her teacup between her palms. Oh, just fragments really. Images that come to me sometimes when I'm in certain rooms. A woman in Victorian dress, standing at the window in the front parlor, looking out at the garden with such longing. A couple dancing in the main hall during what must have been a Christmas party, the woman laughing at something the man whispered in her ear. She paused, her eyes growing distant. Sometimes the images are so vivid, I almost feel as though I was there myself. Every word she spoke seemed to echo what Charles had seen in those photographs. The Victorian dress, the Christmas parties, the intimate moments between couples who looked exactly like them, but supposedly lived decades or centuries before their births. Was Camilla describing actual memories, or was this some elaborate game she was playing with him? That's quite an imagination you have, Charles said, testing her response. Is it imagination? Camilla asked, meeting his eyes directly. Sometimes I wonder if there are things about this world that we don't fully understand, patterns and connections that exist beyond what we can explain with logic and science. She took a sip of her tea, her gaze never leaving his face. Do you believe in mysteries, Charles? In the possibility that reality might be stranger and more complex than it appears? The directness of her question caught him off guard. This wasn't the casual conversation they usually had over evening tea. This felt like an interrogation, or perhaps a confession waiting to happen. Charles realized that his discovery of the hidden chamber might have been inevitable, that perhaps Camilla had been leading him toward it in ways he hadn't recognized. I've always been a practical man, he said slowly. I believe in what I can see and touch and understand. But tonight, he hesitated, unsure how much to reveal about what he had found. Tonight, I feel as though the world might be less solid than I thought. Camilla's eyes brightened with what looked like hope, or perhaps relief. What happened tonight, Charles? What made you feel that way? The moment stretched between them, heavy with potential. Charles could feel that they were approaching some kind of threshold, a point beyond which their relationship would never be the same. He could continue pretending he had found nothing, could try to maintain the illusion of their normal life for a while longer. Or he could ask the questions that were burning in his mind, regardless of how impossible the answers might be. I found something, he said finally, while I was searching for those documents. Something I don't understand. Camilla set down her teacup with infinite care, her movements precise and controlled. What did you find? A room, Charles said, watching her face intently for any sign of surprise or alarm. A hidden room beneath the east wing, filled with photographs. Old photographs that don't make any sense. If he had expected shock or confusion, he was disappointed. Camilla's expression remained calm, though he thought he detected a subtle shift in her posture, a tension that hadn't been there moments before. Photographs of what? She asked quietly. Charles took a deep breath, knowing that his next words would change everything between them. Photographs of us, Camilla. Hundreds of them, spanning what looks like more than a century. Pictures of you and me in clothes from different eras, standing in front of this house, looking exactly as we do now, but supposedly taken decades before either of us was born. Silence filled the kitchen like a living thing. The only sounds were the ticking of the clock on the wall and the steady drumming of rain against the windows. Camilla stared at him for a long moment, her green eyes unreadable. Then, slowly, she nodded. I was wondering when you would find that room, she said, her voice so quiet he had to strain to hear it. I've been waiting for this conversation for so long, Charles. Longer than you could possibly imagine. The simple admission hit him like a physical blow. So she did know about the chamber. Not only did she know about it, but she had been expecting him to discover it. The implications of that knowledge were staggering. How long have you been waiting? He asked. Camilla's smile was sad and infinitely weary. That's the question, isn't it? How do you measure time when it doesn't work the way it's supposed to? When the same moments repeat over and over, when the same people find each other again and again across impossible spans of years. Charles felt the last vestiges of his rational worldview crumbling. What are you saying, Camilla? What are those photographs? They're our lives, she said simply. All of them. Every time we've found each other, Every time we've fallen in love. Every time we've built a life together only to lose it and start again. The photographs are proof of something I've known for longer than human memory should allow, that some connections transcend the normal rules of time and death. The words hung between them like a bridge to an impossible country. Charles wanted to reject what she was saying, wanted to cling to the familiar comfort of disbelief. But the evidence he had seen with his own eyes made denial futile. That's not possible, he said weakly. Isn't it? Camilla leaned forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You felt it too, Charles, even if you haven't understood what you were feeling. The sense that we've had conversations before, that we've shared moments that seem to carry the weight of much more history than our 23 years together should allow. The dreams where you remember things that never happened, or perhaps happened so long ago that they feel like dreams. Charles's mind reeled as fragments of memory surfaced, moments he had dismissed as déjà vu or tricks of imagination. The strange familiarity he had felt the first time Camilla brought him to this house, as if he had walked these halls before. The dreams where he remembered growing old with her, remembered her dying in his arms, remembered a grief so profound it felt like it would tear him apart. Dreams that had seemed vivid enough to be memories, but had made no sense in the context of their actual relationship. How many times? He whispered. I don't know exactly, Camilla admitted. I lose count sometimes, and the memories from different cycles tend to blur together. But I've been keeping records for the past few iterations, trying to understand the pattern, trying to figure out if there's a way to break it. Break it? The phrase sent a new wave of terror through Charles. What do you mean, break it? Camilla's expression grew pained. This isn't the life we're supposed to have, Charles. This endless repetition, this cycle of finding each other, and losing each other, and starting over with no memory of what came before. We're trapped in something, caught in a loop that keeps us bound to each other across time, but never allows us to truly live. The implications of what she was saying slowly sank in. If what Camilla claimed was true, then their entire relationship, everything he thought he knew about his own life, was just one iteration in an endless series of repetitions. The woman he loved had lived through this scenario countless times before, had watched him discover the truth again and again, had had this same conversation in this same kitchen across decades, or perhaps centuries. Do I always find the room? He asked. Usually, Camilla said with a sad smile. Sometimes it takes longer, sometimes you stumble across it by accident as you did tonight. Once, you never found it at all, and I had to show you. That was one of the hardest conversations I've ever had to have. And what happens after I find out? What happens to us? Camilla's tears finally spilled over, running silently down her cheeks. That depends, Charles. Sometimes you can't accept what I tell you, and you leave. Sometimes you try to stay, but the knowledge drives you mad. Sometimes we have a few happy years together before the cycle resets, and we start over as strangers. And you remember all of this? Every time. More with each iteration, Camilla said, wiping at her eyes. At first, I only had fragments, impressions that something wasn't quite right. But, over time, the memories have become clearer and more complete. I think whatever force is keeping us trapped wants me to remember, wants me to suffer with the knowledge of what we're losing over and over again. Charles stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the kitchen floor. The walls seemed to be closing in around him, and he felt an almost desperate need for fresh air. I need to think, he said. I need time to process this. I understand, Camilla said, though her voice carried a note of resigned sadness that suggested she had been through this reaction before. But, Charles, please don't run away from this. Don't run away from us. We have so little time before it starts over again. How much time? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. It varies, she said. Sometimes we have decades together once you learn the truth. Sometimes only months or even weeks. I've tried to find a pattern, but if there is one, it's beyond my understanding. Charles moved toward the kitchen door, then paused. The documents, he said. The insurance documents you sent me to look for. They were just an excuse, weren't they? You wanted me to find that room. Camilla nodded. I've been trying to work up the courage to tell you directly, but I always lose my nerve. It's easier to let you discover it yourself, to let the evidence speak for itself. I'm sorry for the deception, but I didn't know how else to handle it. Is any of it real? Charles asked. Our marriage, our life together, the love I feel for you? Or is it all just some cosmic joke, some elaborate illusion? The love is real, Camilla said with fierce certainty. That's the one thing I'm absolutely sure of, Charles. Whatever else is happening to us, whatever force is controlling our lives, the love we feel for each other is genuine. It's the only constant across all the iterations, the only thing that never changes. Charles nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed her or if belief was even possible in the face of such impossibility. "I'll be in the library," he said. "I need to think about all of this, to try to make sense of it." "Charles," Camilla called as he reached the doorway. "I know this is overwhelming. I know it's more than any person should have to accept. But please remember that whatever else is true, I love you. I've loved you across centuries and lifetimes, and I'll love you through whatever comes next." Charles looked back at her, this woman he thought he knew completely but who had just revealed herself to be something beyond his understanding. She sat alone at their kitchen table, tears still streaming down her face, looking simultaneously like the familiar wife he had shared breakfast with that morning and like a stranger carrying secrets that span generations. "I love you too," he said, and meant it despite everything. "I just don't know what that means anymore." As he walked through the darkened halls toward the library, Charles realized that his life had been divided into two distinct periods, before he found the hidden chamber, and after. The man who had entered that storage room a few hours earlier no longer existed. In his place was someone who had to confront the possibility that everything he thought he knew about reality, about love, about the nature of existence itself, might be wrong. The storm continued to rage outside, battering the old house with wind and rain. But inside, in the growing silence between him and Camilla, a different kind of tempest was brewing, one that threatened to tear apart not just their marriage, but their understanding of what it meant to be human in a universe that might be far stranger and more complex than either of them had ever imagined. Charles spent the night in the library, surrounded by books that had once provided him comfort, but now seemed inadequate to explain the impossible reality he was facing. He tried to read, hoping that familiar routines might help him process what Camilla had told him, but the words blurred together on the page. Instead, he found himself staring out the tall windows at the storm, watching lightning illuminate the grounds where he had walked thousands of times, grounds that, according to his wife, he had walked in other lifetimes as well. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those photographs again, the impossible images of himself and Camilla spanning decades or centuries. His rational mind kept searching for alternative explanations, elaborate hoaxes, digital manipulation, cases of mistaken identity. But the evidence had been too comprehensive, too detailed, too obviously genuine for any of those theories to hold water. When dawn finally broke gray and cloudy through the library windows, Charles heard Camilla moving about in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as she had every morning for 23 years. The normalcy of those familiar sounds felt surreal in light of their conversation the night before. How could she maintain such ordinary routines when she carried the weight of impossible memories? He found her standing at the stove, making his eggs exactly the way he liked them, her silver hair catching the weak morning light. She looked tired, as if she hadn't slept any better than he had. But when she saw him in the doorway, her face brightened with hope. "Good morning," she said carefully, studying his expression for signs of how he was handling everything. "I wasn't sure if you'd want breakfast, but I thought I should maintain some semblance of normal routine." "Normal," Charles repeated, testing the word. "I'm not sure I remember what that means anymore." Camilla set down her spatula and turned to face him fully. "I know this is difficult, Charles. I've watched you struggle with this revelation before, and it never gets easier to witness." "Tell me about the first time," Charles said, settling into his usual chair at the breakfast table. "The first time I found out. How did it happen?" Camilla brought their plates to the table and sat across from him, her movements careful and deliberate. "It was different then. We had been married for nearly 30 years in that iteration, much longer than this time. You found some old journals I had forgotten to hide properly, journals where I had been recording my fragmentary memories. You confronted me about them, demanding explanations for things I had written about events that supposedly happened before I was born. How did I react?" "Badly," Camilla admitted with a sad smile. "You accused me of elaborate lies, of having some kind of mental breakdown. You insisted I see doctors, specialists. When the memories kept coming back, when I kept insisting that what I remembered was real, you had me committed to an asylum." Charles felt a stab of horror at the thought of himself doing such a thing to the woman he loved. "God, Camilla, I'm so sorry. You were protecting yourself the only way you knew how," she said gently. "The human mind isn't designed to accept impossibilities. When faced with evidence that challenges everything we believe about reality, Most people choose to reject the evidence rather than change their beliefs. What happened to us in that iteration? I spent 3 years in the asylum before I learned to tell the doctors what they wanted to hear, before I convinced them I had recovered from my delusions. When I was finally released, you had remarried. You had tried to move on with your life, to find a version of normal that didn't include me and my impossible memories. Camilla's voice grew soft with old pain. I watched from a distance as you grew old with another woman, watched you die without ever seeing you again. Charles reached across the table to take her hand, overwhelmed by the thought of her suffering alone through such loss. How did you bear it? I told myself that it would be different the next time, that I would find a better way to help you understand. I spent the years between that life and our next meeting researching, trying to find some explanation for what was happening to us. I explored every possibility: reincarnation, time loops, parallel dimensions, supernatural curses. Nothing quite fit what we were experiencing. And when did we meet again? 47 years later, Camilla said without hesitation. You were a young man again, 28 years old, working as a journalist in London. I was the same age I had been when we first met in our original life, 25. You were investigating a story about mysterious disappearances at an old estate in the countryside. This estate? Yes. I had been living here alone, waiting for you to find me. When you arrived to interview me about the supposed hauntings and disappearances, the attraction between us was immediate and overwhelming, just as it always is. We were married within 6 months. Charles tried to imagine himself as a young journalist, meeting Camilla for what he thought was the first time, but which was actually their second life together. Did you tell me the truth that time? I tried to, earlier than I had before, hoping that if you learned about our history while our love was new and strong, you might be more willing to accept it. But the photographs weren't as extensive then. The evidence wasn't as overwhelming as it is now. You thought I was either lying to manipulate you somehow or suffering from elaborate delusions. You left after 2 years, convinced that I was dangerous. How many times have we had this conversation? Charles asked. Camilla was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her untouched eggs. This is the 7th iteration where I've told you the complete truth. There have been others where I never found the courage, where I tried to live with the secret and hoped that somehow we could have a normal life together despite everything. And what happened in those cases? The cycle always resets eventually, regardless of whether you know about it or not. Sometimes we live to old age in ignorance. Sometimes one of us dies young in an accident or from illness. Sometimes external circumstances tear us apart. The longest we've ever been together in one iteration was 48 years. The shortest was 6 months. Charles felt a chill at the casual way she mentioned their deaths, as if she were discussing changes in the weather rather than the end of their lives. Do you remember dying? Sometimes, Camilla said quietly. Not always, but sometimes. Usually it's peaceful. We grow old together and pass away in our sleep. But there have been exceptions. Car accidents, illnesses. Once there was a house fire that took us both. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. The worst part isn't the dying, Charles. It's the forgetting. Every time we start over, you have no memory of our previous lives together. I watch you discover me as if for the first time, and I have to fall in love with you all over again while carrying the weight of all our shared history alone. But I always do. Charles asked. Fall in love with you again? Always, Camilla said with a smile that was equal parts joy and sorrow. That's been the one constant. No matter what circumstances bring us together, no matter what our ages or situations, the connection between us is immediate and undeniable. Sometimes I think that's what's keeping us trapped in this cycle. Our love is so strong that it transcends death itself, but something is preventing us from moving on to whatever comes next. Charles pushed his eggs around on his plate, his appetite completely gone. The idea that he had lived and died multiple times, that he had loved and lost this woman again and again across what sounded like centuries, was almost too much to process. How do you know when a new cycle is beginning? How do you find me? It's different each time, Camilla explained. Sometimes I'm born as a baby and have to live through childhood again, but with adult memories intact. Sometimes I simply wake up one day in a younger body with all my memories intact. Sometimes there are years between our cycles, sometimes decades. I always find myself drawn back to this house eventually. It seems to be some kind of anchor point for whatever force is controlling our lives. And you find me? Sometimes I have to search for you. Sometimes you find me, drawn by the same force that brings me back here. In this iteration, you were a widower living in the village. Your first wife had died of cancer 5 years earlier. You came to the house to interview me for a historical society newsletter about the old families in the area. Her smile became more genuine. You stayed for tea and ended up staying for life. Charles remembered that day clearly, the way he had felt an instant connection to this elegant woman who seemed to understand him in ways his late wife never had. He had felt guilty about that connection at first, as if he were betraying Margaret's memory by falling in love again so completely and so quickly. I remember, he said. I remember feeling like I had been waiting my whole life to meet you, even though I had no idea what I was waiting for. That's the part of this that isn't cruel, Camilla said. No matter how many times we go through it, the love is always real, always new, always strong enough to build a life on. If anything, it seems to get stronger with each iteration, as if our souls recognize each other even when our minds don't remember. You said you've been keeping records, trying to understand the pattern. Have you learned anything? Camilla nodded, her expression growing more serious. Some things. The cycles seem to be getting shorter over time. In our early iterations, we often had 30 or 40 years together. In recent cycles, we rarely have more than 25. And the resets are becoming more frequent. There's less time between the end of one life and the beginning of the next. What do you think that means? I think whatever is keeping us trapped is running out of patience, Camilla said grimly, as if the force controlling our lives is growing tired of the repetition and is accelerating towards some kind of conclusion. Charles felt a new wave of fear at her words. What kind of conclusion? I don't know, Camilla admitted. But I've started having dreams, fragments of memories that don't fit with any of our recorded iterations. Dreams about a choice we made long ago, a bargain we struck that bound us to this endless cycle. I think our original lives, our first meeting, might have ended in some kind of tragedy that we're being forced to relive until we can find a way to resolve it. What kind of tragedy? Camilla shook her head. The memories are too fragmented, too distorted by time. I see images of this house, but much older, from perhaps the late 1800s. I see us as young lovers, but there's always a sense of impending doom, of some terrible choice approaching. And I see a third person, someone whose presence brings danger to our love. A third person? A man, I think. Someone who loved one of us, but couldn't have what he wanted. In the dreams, his jealousy and rage are almost tangible. But I can never see his face clearly, and I can't remember what he did or how our original story ended. Charles stood and walked to the window, looking out at the grounds where morning mist was beginning to rise from the rain-soaked earth. The idea that their endless cycle of love and loss was somehow connected to events that had happened over a century ago was almost impossible to comprehend. Is there a way to break the cycle? He asked without turning around. I think so, Camilla said. I've been studying occult texts, historical records, anything that might explain supernatural phenomena like what we're experiencing. I believe that if we can understand what originally trapped us, if we can resolve whatever tragedy started this cycle, we might be able to find peace. Or we might make things worse. Yes, Camilla admitted. That's always the risk. But, Charles, I'm tired of this existence. I'm tired of loving you and losing you over and over again. I'm tired of carrying the weight of our history alone while you rediscover everything from the beginning each time. If there's a chance to break free, even if it means risking everything, I think we have to take it. Charles turned back to face her, this woman who had suffered through lifetimes of love and loss while he remained blissfully ignorant. The courage it must have taken for her to endure so much, the strength required to keep hoping that someday they might find a way to escape their supernatural prison, was staggering. What do you need me to do? He asked. Hope bloomed in Camilla's eyes. You're willing to try? Even knowing how dangerous it might be. I love you, Charles said simply. If what you're telling me is true, then I've loved you across multiple lifetimes without even knowing it. That kind of love, that kind of connection, deserves to be free. We deserve to be free. Camilla stood and crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. There's more I need to show you, she said. More evidence, more records. I've been documenting everything I can remember about our different lives, looking for clues about what happened to us originally. But, Charles, once you see everything, once you know the full scope of what we're facing, there will be no going back to ignorance. Are you sure you're ready for that? Charles looked into her green eyes, these eyes he had gazed into across breakfast tables and in moonlit bedrooms for 23 years, eyes that, according to her, had been watching him with love for far longer than any human lifetime should allow. Whatever lay ahead, whatever truths she still needed to share. He knew he couldn't face the prospect of losing her again without at least trying to understand what was happening to them. "Show me everything," he said. Camilla led Charles back through the familiar corridors of their home. But this time their destination wasn't the hidden chamber beneath the east wing. Instead, she guided him to her private study, a room he had always respected as her personal space and rarely entered without invitation. Now, as she unlocked the heavy wooden door with an ornate brass key, Charles realized there might have been more significant reasons for his exclusion from this space. The study was larger than he remembered, its walls lined with bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. But these weren't the familiar novels and histories he had expected to find. Instead, the shelves were filled with ancient texts, leather-bound volumes that looked centuries old, and modern books on subjects he hadn't known Camilla was interested in. Supernatural phenomena, reincarnation, time manipulation, and quantum physics. "I've spent decades collecting these," Camilla explained, noticing his surprised expression. "Every iteration, I try to gather more information to understand what's happening to us. Some of the older books have followed me somehow from life to life, appearing on these shelves no matter how many times our cycle resets." Charles moved deeper into the room, drawn to a large desk positioned near the window. Its surface was covered with photographs, documents, and what appeared to be detailed charts and timelines. Unlike the hidden chamber with its overwhelming collection of images, this space felt like a research laboratory, organized and purposeful in its pursuit of answers. "This is where I try to make sense of it all," Camilla said, joining him at the desk. "Every memory I recover, every detail I can piece together about our different lives, gets recorded here. I've been hoping that if I could map our entire history, I might be able to identify the moment when everything went wrong." Charles examined the charts spread across the desk surface. They showed timelines spanning from the late 1800s to the present day, with detailed notations marking the beginning and end of different iterations of their lives together. The meticulous record-keeping was staggering. Camilla had documented not just the major events of their various relationships, but small details as well. The houses they had lived in, the jobs they had held, the friends they had made and lost. "This one here," Camilla said, pointing to an entry near the beginning of the earliest chart. "This is what I believe was our original life, the one where everything started. 1887 to 1889. We were both much younger then. I was 19 when we met. You were 22. You were a doctor, newly graduated from medical school. I was the daughter of the family that owned this estate. What happened to us?" Camilla's expression darkened. "That's where the memories become unclear. I know we fell in love very quickly, much as we always do. But there was opposition to our relationship. My father disapproved of you, thought you were too poor and socially inferior to marry his daughter. He wanted me to marry someone else, someone who could enhance the family's social standing and financial position." "And did you?" "No," Camilla said firmly. "I refused. I told my father that I would marry you or no one. That's when things became dangerous." Charles studied the timeline, noting that their original life together had lasted only 2 years. "What made it dangerous?" "There was another man, someone my father preferred as a husband for me. In my fragmentary memories, I see him as a figure of menace, someone whose desire for me had twisted into something dark and possessive. When it became clear that I would never accept his proposal, when he realized that I loved you completely and irrevocably, his love turned to hatred. Hatred for you? For both of us, but especially for you. He saw you as the obstacle to his happiness, the reason he couldn't have what he wanted. The memories are unclear, but I believe he arranged for something terrible to happen to us, something that resulted in both our deaths." Charles felt a chill as he studied the notations on the chart. The entry for their original life ended with a stark notation. Deaths: Charles, October 15th, 1889. Camilla, October 15th, 1889. Cause unknown. "We died on the same day?" "I believe we died together," Camilla said quietly. "In the dreams I have about our original life, there's always a sense of impending tragedy, a feeling that we're running out of time. And, at the end, there's a moment of choice, a decision we made together that somehow bound our souls to this endless repetition." "What kind of choice?" Camilla moved to one of the bookshelves and retrieved a slim volume bound in black leather. The title, embossed in faded gold letters, read Spiritual Bonds and Eternal Contracts. She opened the book to a page marked with a silk ribbon and read aloud. "When love faces the ultimate separation, When death threatens to tear apart souls that are meant to be united, some lovers make the desperate choice to bind themselves together beyond the grave. Such bonds, forged in passion and desperation, can transcend the normal cycle of life and death, but they often come with unexpected consequences. She looked up at Charles. I think when we realized we were going to die, when we understood that this other man was going to destroy our chance at happiness, we made some kind of pact. We chose to bind our souls together so that death couldn't separate us. But something went wrong. The bond worked, but not the way we intended. Instead of allowing us to be together in death, it trapped us in a cycle of repeated lives, always finding each other, but never able to truly be free. And I believe the man who caused our original deaths is somehow part of this cycle as well, a malevolent force that ensures our happiness is always temporary. Charles felt a growing sense of dread as the implications of what Camilla was telling him began to sink in. Are you saying he's still alive? Still interfering with our lives? Not alive in the traditional sense, Camilla said, returning the book to its shelf. But his hatred and jealousy were so strong that they became part of the supernatural bond that traps us. In some of our iterations, external forces have torn us apart. Accidents, illnesses, circumstances that seemed random but followed patterns that suggest deliberate interference. She moved to another section of the desk and picked up a photograph Charles hadn't noticed before. It showed him and Camilla from what appeared to be the 1940s, standing in front of a different house, both looking younger and happier than in the more recent photographs from the hidden chamber. This was taken during our fourth iteration, Camilla said. We had been married for 15 years and had 2 children. We were happy, settled, looking forward to growing old together. Then, you were drafted into the war, sent to fight in Europe. You died at Normandy, one of thousands of casualties on D-Day. Charles stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile the smiling man in the image with his understanding of his own history. I fought in World War II. Your death there wasn't random, Camilla continued. I've researched the military records. You were assigned to one of the most dangerous units, given missions that had extremely low survival rates. Other men with similar training and experience were assigned to safer positions, but you were consistently placed in harm's way. You think it was arranged? I think the malevolent force that originally destroyed our happiness found a way to manipulate events, to ensure that even when we found temporary peace, it wouldn't last. Sometimes the interference is subtle, a job transfer that separates us, an illness that strikes at the wrong time. Sometimes it's more direct. Charles set down the photograph and looked around the study with new eyes. This wasn't just a research space. It was a war room, the headquarters for Camilla's century-long battle against whatever force was keeping them trapped. Have you ever tried to find him? Charles asked. This man who originally destroyed our happiness. I've tried, Camilla said. But it's difficult to research someone when I can't remember his name or what he looked like. I know he existed. I know he was connected to this house and to my family, but the specific details are hidden from me. It's as if the supernatural bond that binds us also prevents me from fully remembering our original enemy. What about records from the estate? Family histories, local newspapers from that time period? I've searched everything I could find, Camilla said, moving to another bookshelf and retrieving a stack of old newspapers and documents. But there are gaps in the records, deliberate omissions that suggest someone has been working to hide the truth. Newspaper issues from late 1889 are missing from every archive I've checked. Family documents from that period have vanished. Even the local church records show unexplained gaps around the time of our deaths. Charles examined the documents, noting the way the historical records seemed to skip over the months when their original tragedy had occurred. It was as if someone had systematically removed all evidence of what had happened during that crucial time period. There is one lead I haven't fully pursued, Camilla said hesitantly. But it would require us to take a significant risk. What kind of lead? Camilla moved to the largest bookshelf and retrieved a leather journal that looked even older than the others. Its pages were yellowed with age, and the writing inside was in a different hand than Camilla's familiar script. This appeared on my desk 3 iterations ago, she said. I have no memory of acquiring it, and it's not in my handwriting, but somehow I know it contains information about our original lives. The entries are written by someone who was present during our first meeting and subsequent courtship, someone who witnessed what happened to us. Charles took the journal and opened it carefully. The writing was in an old-fashioned style, the ink faded but still legible. The first entry was dated July 15th, 1887. Miss Camilla has met a young doctor today, Charles read aloud. The attraction between them was immediate and obvious to all who witnessed their introduction at the summer garden party. Father disapproves, of course. He has other plans for her future, plans that do not include a penniless physician with more idealism than sense. But I have seen the way they look at each other, and I fear this will not end well for anyone involved. Keep reading, Camilla urged. Charles turned the pages, finding entry after entry documenting the progression of their original relationship. The unknown writer described their secret meetings, their growing love, and the increasing tension within Camilla's family as it became clear that she would not be dissuaded from her choice. August 20th, 1887, Charles read. Mr. Thornton called upon Father today to formally request permission to court Miss Camilla. Father was delighted, of course, but when he informed Camilla of the arrangement, she flew into a rage such as I have never witnessed. She declared that she would rather die than marry Thornton, that she belongs to Charles and no other. Father has forbidden her from leaving the house until she comes to her senses. Thornton, Camilla said. That's the first time I've seen his name written anywhere. I've been searching for any historical records of a man named Thornton connected to this estate, but I found nothing. Charles continued reading, finding entries that described increasingly desperate attempts to separate him and Camilla, and Thornton's growing obsession with claiming her as his wife. The journal painted a picture of a man whose love had transformed into dangerous possessiveness. September 30th, 1887, Charles read. Thornton's behavior grows more alarming by the day. He has taken to following Miss Camilla whenever she leaves the house, and yesterday I saw him watching the doctor's house from the shadows across the street. When Father suggested that perhaps another suitor might be more suitable, Thornton became violent, declaring that if he cannot have Camilla, no one can. There, Camilla said, pointing to the entry. That's the threat that led to our deaths. He couldn't accept losing me, so he arranged for both of us to be eliminated. Charles turned to the final entries in the journal, expecting to find details about their deaths. But the writing here was different, more hurried and desperate. October 14th, 1889, he read. Tomorrow they plan to elope. Charles and Camilla have arranged to meet at the old chapel at midnight and flee together to Scotland, where they can marry without Father's permission. But Thornton knows of their plan. I overheard him speaking with his associates, arranging for something terrible to happen at the chapel. I must warn them, but I fear it may already be too late. The journal ended there, with no description of what had happened at the chapel or how their original lives had ended. But clipped to the final page was a newspaper cutting from a Scottish paper, dated October 17th, 1889. Tragic fire at Highland Chapel. Charles read. A devastating fire destroyed the historic St. Margaret's Chapel near the border yesterday evening, claiming the lives of 2 young English visitors who had apparently sought shelter there during a sudden storm. The victims, identified as Dr. Charles Whitmore and Miss Camilla Fairmont, were found in the chapel ruins, apparently having perished from smoke inhalation. Local authorities suspect the fire was caused by lightning, though the unusual intensity of the blaze has raised questions about its origin. Charles stared at the newspaper clipping, processing the fact that he was reading about his own death in a previous lifetime. The names were different, but somehow he knew these people were him and Camilla, their original selves who had died trying to escape a forced marriage. Lightning, Camilla said bitterly. But I doubt it was natural lightning. Thornton found a way to destroy us even as we tried to escape him. And this journal writer, who do you think it was? I believe it was someone in my family's household, possibly a servant or relative who cared about our welfare. Someone who tried to help us, but failed to prevent the tragedy. Camilla took the journal back and held it carefully. The question is whether this person might have been present during our final moments, whether they might have witnessed the pact we made as we faced death together. Charles felt a growing sense of urgency as the pieces of their supernatural puzzle began falling into place. If they could identify the journal writer, if they could learn more about the exact circumstances of their original deaths, they might finally understand what kind of bond they had forged and how to break it. We need to go back to the beginning, he said. We need to return to that chapel in Scotland, to the place where our original lives ended. If there are answers to be found, if there's a way to break this cycle, that's where we'll find them. Camilla looked at him with a mixture of hope and fear. It's dangerous, Charles. If we're right about Thornton's spirit being part of what's keeping us trapped, then, returning to the site of our original deaths might trigger something we're not prepared to handle. But it might also be our only chance to break free, Charles replied. You said yourself that the cycles are getting shorter, that whatever's controlling our lives is growing impatient. If we don't act soon, we might not get another opportunity. Camilla nodded slowly. You're right. And, Charles, thank you for believing me, for being willing to fight for our freedom. I've been carrying this burden alone for so long that I almost forgot what it felt like to have hope. Charles took her hands in his, looking into the green eyes that had loved him across multiple lifetimes. We're in this together now. Whatever it takes, whatever risks we have to face, we're going to find a way to break this cycle and, finally, be free to love each other the way we were meant to. As they stood together in that room filled with the accumulated research of lifetimes, surrounded by evidence of their impossible history, Charles felt a determination unlike anything he had ever experienced. The man who had stumbled into the hidden chamber just 2 days earlier had been concerned with insurance documents and routine domestic matters. The man who stood here now was preparing to battle supernatural forces that had been tormenting him and his beloved for over a century. Whatever lay ahead, whatever truths awaited them at that Scottish chapel, Charles knew there was no turning back. Their love had survived death itself, had persisted across multiple lifetimes, and had finally brought them to this moment of potential liberation. All that remained was to discover whether their love was strong enough to break the chains that bound them to their endless cycle of loss and renewal. The journey to Scotland took them 3 days, driving through countryside that seemed to shift between familiar and foreign as they traveled further from their home. Camilla had insisted on bringing several of her research books and the mysterious journal, creating a mobile command center in their car as they pursued the location mentioned in the old newspaper clipping. Finding St. Margaret's Chapel proved more difficult than Charles had anticipated. The 1889 newspaper had been vague about the exact location, mentioning only that it was near the border between England and Scotland. Modern maps showed no trace of any chapel by that name in the area, and local historians they contacted had no knowledge of such a building ever existing. It was Camilla who finally solved the puzzle, cross-referencing entries in her ancient books with topographical maps from the late 19th century. The chapel, she discovered, had been built on land that was now part of a private estate, its ruins probably hidden somewhere in the extensive forests that covered the property. The current landowner might not even know it's there, Camilla explained as they drove up the winding road toward the estate's main house. These old chapel ruins are scattered all over Scotland, remnants from medieval times when there were religious communities in even the most remote areas. Charles felt his nervousness growing as they approached their destination. Everything about this journey felt momentous, as if they were traveling not just through space but through time itself, moving toward a confrontation with their own history that would determine their future. The weight of multiple lifetimes seemed to press down on him, making every mile they traveled feel significant. The estate's current owner, an elderly man named MacDougall, proved surprisingly helpful once Camilla explained they were researching local history. He confirmed that there were indeed old ruins somewhere on his property, though he had never paid much attention to them. My grandfather mentioned something about an old chapel back in the woods, MacDougall said, leading them to his study to examine maps of the property. Said there had been a fire there sometime in the last century, before his time. Never thought much about it myself. These hills are full of old stones and broken walls. He traced a path on the map with his finger, showing them how to reach what he believed was the location of the ruins. About 2 miles through the forest, following the old shepherd's track. You'll want to be careful. Some of those stones are unstable, and the area gets boggy when it rains. They thanked MacDougall and set off into the forest, carrying flashlights and emergency supplies despite the afternoon sunshine. Charles felt a strange sense of déjà vu as they walked along the narrow path, as if his feet had traveled this route before. The sensation grew stronger with each step they took deeper into the woods. Do you recognize any of this? Camilla asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. It feels familiar, Charles admitted. Not exactly like a memory, but like a half-remembered dream. As if I've walked this path before, but in a different context. The ruins, when they finally found them, were more extensive than either of them had expected. What remained of St. Margaret's Chapel sat in a small clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees, their branches forming a natural cathedral over the tumbled stones. The basic outline of the building was still visible: foundation walls, the remains of what had once been an altar, fragments of stone arches that had once supported a roof. But It was the atmosphere of the place that struck Charles most forcefully. There was a sense of lingering sadness here, a weight of old grief that seemed to hang in the air like morning mist. He could feel Camilla's reaction as well, the way she tensed and moved closer to him as they approached the ruins. "This is it," she said quietly. "This is where we died." Charles knelt beside what appeared to have been the main entrance to the chapel, running his hands over stones that were blackened with what could have been ancient fire damage. As his fingers touched the rough surface, images flashed through his mind, fragmentary visions of rain and desperate flight, of love and terror intertwined. "I remember," he said suddenly, his voice filled with wonder and horror. "Not everything, but fragments. Running through the forest at night, holding your hand, knowing we were being pursued. The relief when we saw the chapel, thinking we had found sanctuary." Camilla knelt beside him, tears beginning to stream down her face. "I remember too. The way the storm came up so suddenly, how we thought it was just bad weather. We didn't realize until too late that it wasn't natural." The memories came in waves now, triggered by their proximity to the site of their original deaths. Charles saw himself as a young doctor, desperate to protect the woman he loved from a forced marriage to a man she despised. He remembered Camilla's courage as they fled her father's house in the middle of the night, her determination to choose love over duty regardless of the consequences. And he remembered Thornton. The man materialized in Charles's recovered memories like a figure from a nightmare, tall and imposing, with cold eyes and a smile that never quite reached his face. Thornton had been older than both of them, wealthy and influential, accustomed to having his desires fulfilled without question. When Camilla had refused his proposal, his love had twisted into something dark and possessive. "He followed us," Camilla said, her own memories apparently returning with equal clarity. "Even after we thought we had escaped, even after we had reached Scotland, he couldn't accept that he had lost me." "The fire wasn't lightning," Charles said, the truth of their deaths becoming clear in his mind. "He trapped us in the chapel and set it ablaze, planning to make it look like an accident. But we didn't just die," Camilla continued, her voice growing stronger as more memories returned. "As the smoke filled the chapel, as we realized we were going to perish together, we made a vow." Charles closed his eyes, letting the memory wash over him. He could see himself and Camilla, their younger selves, holding each other in that burning chapel as death approached. The terror of their situation had been overwhelming, but beneath it was a love so strong that it had refused to accept defeat. "We swore to find each other again," he remembered. "We promised that not even death would separate us, that our love would transcend whatever came after life. But we didn't understand the price of that vow," Camilla added sadly.